Hey everyone, Uncle Jessy here. This is the Hitry Rocket 1 Resin 3 printer that's up on Kickstarter right now, and today I'm going to be giving you my initial thoughts on this machine. This thing stands at about 2.5 feet tall. It is very tall and very narrow, and yeah, it's sort of shaped like a rocket nose cone. I'm not going to be doing a full review since this is a pre-production unit that's very early in the Kickstarter process here, and more than likely, fingers crossed even, things will change on this unit based on some feedback before it goes live, or it's in full production mode. And to ease everyone's tensions, I'll let you know right away, it does actually print, and I'm getting some stunning prints off of this machine, but there are some quirks that I'm trying to work through with it. And a few of the things that set this apart from other Resin 3 printers that are out on the market are, yeah, it looks like a rocket, but the others are that it's supposed to print stupidly fast, and it is the fastest Resin 3 printer that I've worked with so far. I don't know if it's exactly as fast as they're claiming, or I may not be able to just get it to print that fast, but the other thing that they are claiming, and I can confirm, there's no FEP sheets that you're gonna need for this. You're not gonna be looking at replacing screens or anything like that. It's wildly impressive, and you should be able to get a lot, and I do mean a lot, of prints off of this machine. The Rocket 1 has a build volume of 143 by 89 by 150 millimeters. And the core idea of how this printer works compared to other resin printers that are out there is that this is projecting a UV image down from the top on top of the resin. Most resin 3D printers that you see on the consumer market today are projecting up into the resin onto a build plate. This is projecting down onto the build plate. So it's a really different process, and because it's working that way, there's no FEP sheets that are needed for it. There's no pull force that's really required with this, or suction force that's happening. There is the perforated build plate that we'll be talking about in a little bit more detail as well. That's going to allow that resin to fully flow through it as it's lowering and lifting back out of the resin. I should also mention that I'm not going to be showing off the light source and that component there. They did request that I did not show that off as part of any of the videos that I'm working with. I think they're just trying to keep that as their little secret sauce for right now of how their machines are working, so I'm not going to be showing that off as they've requested. Hitry did send this machine over to me for making video content purposes for you all here today. They're not paying me for this. I have not provided this video to them prior to them seeing it here, just like you all are, and are hearing my feedback directly at the same time that you're hearing it as well. And in fact, after I'm done making these videos, I need to send this back over to them. Some other things about the printer that I wanted to cover with you is that this is actually two sort of minor pain points about the machine right off the bat here, is that the USB port is in the very back of the machine. Having it on the front would make so much more sense than all the way in the top back of the machine. I'm so nervous every time I go to take this out and plug it back in that I'm going to accidentally knock this thing over. It is slightly top heavy as well, and it's that unique design that I'm slightly nervous around it, that I'm going to bump into this and knock it over, but so far that hasn't happened. Power cable that comes with the machine is insanely short. It is 3 feet long and is just barely long enough for me to reach the back of the machine to the outlet under my table. So you're going to need some kind of an extension cable, or order a different one, or maybe they'll provide a longer cable when the official units roll out. I'm not entirely sure, but this cable is way too short. One other critical aspect about this machine that differs from other Resin 3 printers that are out there is that it is absolutely critical that you have this machine on a level surface, or that you use the adjustable feet on the bottom to make sure that it's properly level, which can be a little bit tricky to find out, because what you typically have to do is fill up the vat inside of the machine first and make sure it's not leaning one side or the other, because if it is, you're going to have some issues trying to get your prints up and running. There's also this great button on the front of the machine to power it on, which I just love, that click button interface, and it's nice that that is on the front of the machine. One of the other things here you'll see are these LED lights that are on the that are running around the side of the machine. That again helps differentiate this from other units out there. I don't believe these change colors at all, like to give you a status indicator that a print's done or in progress or anything like that. That would kind of be cool if it did. The fan is always on, regardless if you're printing or not. That is for sure. Firmware settings, typically that you can modify in 3D printers. So hopefully that will get modified. If not, you might have to change it after you get your own machine via the G code that you can modify that it's only on when it's actually printing. You'll also see it's running this pretty standardized Chitu interface here. It is running a Chitu board and works directly with Chitubox. And it's really that same standard interface that you see on most Resin 3D printers, along with all of the exact same functions. Because they've also hit a Kickstarter threshold, it will also include 1 full year of Chitubox Pro, which is a pretty nice add-on. That the folks over at Lychee, with their latest version, have support for the newer Chitubox software CTB file formats. So the Hitry, the Rocket 1, will be supported eventually once that's made available. I'm already talking with them currently about getting the information over and testing that out for them here, hopefully in the next few days. I've powered back on the printer, and just showing you from the front, there is this acrylic panel door system here. It has a taped hinge, which I found really kind of odd here. I don't know if there is, you know, it's a plastic hinge or a rubber hinge on the backside. I think this might be just some gaffer's tape here or electrical tape that's holding it more securely in place. It would have been great to see something a little bit better in place for that. Also, there's no easy way to keep the door wide open. There is a little bit of a door stopper thing there, but it barely keeps the door open. Certainly not wide enough that you can reliably get in there and work with it. For now, all I've been doing is taking a bottle of resin and mounting it open here so that I can more easily work directly in the printer. The other thing that you'll notice is that there is a light that is on all of the time, and it's a yellow light, which I've called this out in the past with some other printers that have lights built into them. It's just absolutely horrible for folks like myself that like to make content and share it online. If I wanted to take a picture of a print inside the printer, I have a very difficult time of doing that without finding a way to cover up that light somehow. It's great that you can see in there, but it would be awesome if there was a way to disable that light through the software or through the firmware touchscreen interface of the printer. I'm using, this is Sarai-Tech Fast Grain resin, so yes, in fact, it does work with other resins, and I've been able to reliably get it to print with other resins, which was great to see. And here's the build plate that you can remove and take on and off. So you can take it on and off very easily here. It just clicks into place onto the 2 bars there that are holding it up. That's the bar that's gonna help lift it in and out of the vat. This is a very large and deep plastic vat. This thing holds 4 of these bottles of the Hitry resin, almost exactly 4 bottles of the Hitry resin, or about 3.5 liters of your standard resin that you're working with. So the Sarai-Tech Fast resin, it took about 3.5 bottles for me to fill this entire tank up. On the very front here, you're also seeing a overspill or reservoir, so that as you're printing, it's gonna cause resin to overflow the top and go into a little trench here, and it fills up this reservoir. So you're not making a massive mess. And we'll get to the massive mess part in just a little bit. Also, if you look closely here, this is some cured Hitry resin that I'm having a really hard time getting out of this little reservoir. There's also a trench that runs all along the side of the build plate and the vat there that's going to help collect any resin that starts to overspill. However, it's not exactly the cleanest or the greatest when it comes to catching, and you definitely end up making a little bit of a mess there. So one of the main questions I've been asked a lot while folks have learned that I've had this on hand and I've been making TikTok videos and posting random things on Facebook is, how does the actual build plate leveling process work inside this machine? So what you end up needing to do is completely filling that large vat full of resin, or if Hitry has made available whatever the filler liquid is, you should be able to use a majority of that and then only, some of your resin. I'm not entirely sure how all of that still is going to function and work. They did not send any of that for me to test out. They did send over 6 bottles of their resin that I've run off and printed a bunch of things with that I'll be showing off in just a little bit. But what you end up doing is filling up the entire vat with the build plate until it basically gets to the very tippy top of the vat before it starts to overflow. And then you should be able to start your print and it prints properly. But it doesn't always work that way. Again, I think some of the initial issues that I ran into with this machine is that my table wasn't perfectly level and it was causing the vat to be slightly off on one side versus the other. So I was constantly adding a little bit more resin and topping it off, and it was spilling over and causing this massive mess while I was printing. Thankfully, after re-leveling the printer and adding this big cement block here that you can pick up over at Home Depot or Lowe's for like $3 that will help ensure everything is flat and stable, it started to work a lot better. But I was still running into that issue of having it make sure that it be completely topped off, and so that there was a thin layer of resin sitting on top of that build plate before each print starts. And then I realized what I could end up doing is before each print starts, this is kind of a pain, is that you could either top it off before it starts making that massive mess and run the risk of making a major mess, or you can adjust your Z height, the start height for your print. So basically you home the bed and then adjust the Z offset so that it's just barely resting inside the top of the resin, and then go ahead and start your print. And more or less that's worked really well for me. I still have this issue with the perforated build plate that we'll get to here in just a second. But first I wanted to talk about the messy factor of working with this machine. And it is by far the messiest resin 3D printer that I've ever worked with. Yeah, and resin 3D printing is known to be a messy process compared to FDM 3D printing, but this takes it to another level with just a number of the things that I've gone through. And again, this could all come down to a learning curve and just wrapping my brain around how this type of resin 3D printer works versus your traditional 3D printers that you see on the market today. But some of the things that I've run into is just splashing on the inside of the machine. So trying to fill up that vat with resin, you can't reliably pour 3 or 4 bottles of resin into it and then lift it and put it into the printer. That's not going to work. You might be able to put in the first 2, but then after that, you're going to want to put it in the machine and then be pouring the resin directly into the vat inside the printer. And during that pouring process, stuff splashing around. And what you want to make sure you're avoiding is, even though they say you don't need an FEP sheet and you're not going to be replacing screens, if you get splashed resin on top of the lens that's projecting down onto the resin, you're going to run into issues. So basically, every time I've poured resin into the machine, I double and triple check that no resin has gotten up onto that lens. The other thing that you need to be aware of is you are going to have spillovers with this, where you start a print and resin overflows over the vat, over that little dam or reservoir, and cause spillage underneath the printer. So I always make sure that I have paper towels now under the printer, because it has made a significant mess at times when it's starting a print. One thing that I would really like to see Hitry improve on the inside build quality of the machine is to somehow seal up the inside area of the printer. I feel like spillage is inevitable. At one point or another, you're going to have spillage, but at least if it was completely sealed off around the corners of or the sides of the machine, at least no resin would leak into the printer. I feel like I'm beating up on this printer, and I promise you, we're going to look at some prints that might persuade you into either backing it or keeping your Kickstarter pledge at this point. I'm just calling out a lot of the things that I've seen with this machine so far. And as you can see, I've been able to print some really cool things, and I wanted to talk with you about this build plate. And they did send me 2 build plates, which was fantastic to have on hand, because I was able to immediately take one print out and then add this other build plate in and start another print right away while I was working on cleaning up the other print. And that cleanup process is the next thing I wanted to talk about here, because this build plate is perforated and they need it so that it can lift and lower and that resin can pool in from the top or from the bottom up onto the top of the build plate so that it can activate along with the UV light for that curing process. But the pain point is that if you don't have this perfectly level, you're going to end up with resin that's cured on the underside of the build plate, and it is a massive pain to clean up. And I have yet to do a print, maybe I've done one or two, that hasn't required a massive amount of cleanup or a huge mess that I've made with just resin and bits of resin everywhere. Also, those perforations in the build plate, as it's curing in the vat, I believe it's causing lots of excess cured bits of resin to actually float around inside the vat tank while you're printing. And I haven't run into any major issues with that just yet with the machine, where I've seen, big, huge chunks of previously cured resin that appear on my prints. It's just, again, something that I want to call out that I've seen, because when I went to initially clean out the vat, there was a massive amount of this debris inside the bottom of the vat. Also, the design of that vat, there's no really easy way to pour the resin back out of the vat into the bottles. And initially, I made the biggest mess I think I've ever made trying to pour the resin directly from a full vat back into the bottles, before I realized that they did send along a massive syringe that allowed me to suck resin out of the vat, which made it so much easier. But it's still a process that you're going to end up potentially making a big mess, because there's no pour spout area for the resin to easily pour out of. You're just pouring it directly out of one of the corners. Also, the reservoir system that's on that vat, I wish it was a little bit deeper, or better yet, angled toward the front of that catch plate that they have there, the bucket that's on the very front of the vat. That little bucket can kind of be a pain to take on and off, but once you get it, you'll, I think, eventually get it. But it would be great if that was a little bit larger as well. I found myself in the middle of prints having to actually pour that out and then hook it back up really quickly, and it's still pouring and spilling resin as I'm doing that while it's continuing to print. And if you end up not printing anything for a few days, there's no easy way for you to mix up the resin that's inside that really large vat without you pouring it all back out into each individual bottle, shaking them up, and then re-pouring it back in there. Additionally, for all of the little resin bits that can end up in the vat, it would be great if there was some sort of a sifter that you could try and fish those out when you're not printing. With the Hitry resin is it does seem to be extremely light sensitive. I was seeing lots of thinly cured layers of resin, particularly inside that little catch system there. And I believe it's because I have LED lights here, and maybe the LED lights are reacting with the resin, or maybe because of the small crack in the window I have open there, the UV from the window and the light was reacting with this resin. I'm not entirely sure, but it's just something, again, calling out that it is very extremely light sensitive. Now, when it comes to removing prints from the build plate, I do recommend wearing some sort of protective eyewear to protect your eyes from little bits of resin popping off of the build plate. Now, hopefully, I'm able to get this off relatively well. Ooh, look at this. Yeah, it's actually coming up really nicely here. So there we go. This print, I ended up leveling this fairly well. Oh no, there we go. And there are still bits of cured resin in those slots. And to clean those out, I basically just go from the underside and use the little scraper here to push those out as best as I can. Normally they just pop free as you're working with them. The only time I've run into issues is when it overexposes and cures on the bottom side as well from this build plate. And when it comes to printing on the Rocket One, I am seeing some great looking prints on this machine. However, there's one big funky thing with this that I honestly am not a big fan of, and that's when your print finishes, instead of lifting out of the resin for it to drip and drain out, it goes to the bottom of the vat, which really makes no sense whatsoever to me. So to get your print out of the vat, you have to exit out of your print screen, then go back into the settings, and then rehome the build plate so that it will properly lift all the way out of the vat. The G-code, I would hope, can be modified in a way so that it actually homes after the print finishes, instead of going all the way to the bottom. That's what a traditional Resin 3D printer does, is once it finishes, it goes as far as it can, I believe. It'll lift up out of the vat. Well, this is, instead of lifting up, it's backwards, so it's going all the way to the bottom of the vat. It just needs to rehome afterwards to come out of the vat. And I've already talked about the leveling process of topping off the vat before you actually start a print so that the build plate properly just barely sits and gets a thin layer of resin on there for you to start printing with. But again, I think this is all, for me, the challenges that I've run into with it are hopefully mostly user error, because I feel like I've gotten better with using it as I've continued to work with the machine. And in fact, Hitry just posted a video showing them printing one of those articulating dragons with this, and that's notoriously extremely difficult one to just print with a Resin 3D printer, and it showed them very easily removing it from the build plate, which almost shocked me because I've had lots of issues getting my prints off because they might have cured directly under. So again, I think a lot of my issues might rely on user error when it comes to actually getting those off, and hopefully as I continue to play with this, I'll get a little bit better at it. So even though I've called out a number of things about the machine, the most important thing is how it prints, and I'm happy to say when it prints, it does a really great job. So one of the very first things that I went off and printed was one of their Toad test files, and was happy to see how quickly this printed at 36 minutes. I believe it's about 3.5 millimeters tall. And again, the print looks really nice and clean, and is probably a comparable size to a lot of D&D miniatures that you might run off and print. I then went off and printed their Praying Mantis files, which was a 3-hour print, and is a very delicate and intricate piece here, and again, printed very nicely on the Rocket One. Was amazed at some of the details that I was able to see off of this. And again, this is where I started to see some of the leveling issues and just getting the prints off of the build plate and the challenges I was having with that, and damaged some of the files, even cleaning these. These particular prints are so small and delicate. I was having a very hard time properly cleaning them without damaging them, but it was just great to see some of the detail that's able to actually come out of this machine. Now, I did attempt that 17-minute bottle that you've seen them print in their videos that are showing off the lightning fast speeds that this machine can do, and it printed, but as soon as it came out of the vat, it immediately collapsed, and I have yet to be able to properly get that particular file to print with their default settings. And for anybody that's wondering, the default temperature here in my print room hovers around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. So I then wanted to try slicing my own file, so I found this amazing Green Knight head designed by Andrew Martin that I went off and printed, and it turned out fantastic. Really happy with all of the details that this was able to capture, because it is a fairly detailed print. And again, was seeing amazing results off of this machine, which is probably the most important factor with any Resin 3D printer, is how it actually prints. I then went off and tried to print some miniatures from Archvillain games, and again was seeing some bed leveling issues where you can see prints lifting from the build plate because I had it lowered too much into the vat. That's another factor that you could have there, is if it's too low, your prints are not going to adhere and start lifting off of the build plate. But I reprinted those and everything turned out great, other than the fact that I've damaged the miniatures during the cleaning process. I was actually able to get them off of the build plate without too much of a hassle getting them off. I did make a major mess with that again, but the prints themselves turned out amazing. Anything that I'm printing, I always print at 0.05 or lower. Hitry has also mentioned to achieve their crazy fast print speeds, they do recommend printing at 0.1 millimeters, which is something that you might see more typically on an FDM 3D printer. For me, I'm not really interested that much in printing at that resolution on a resin printer, but if I can get it to actually work properly, which I haven't been able to, I'll be testing that out for you guys. The next one I printed was this Void Dragon character from the creature Armory. And it is all in one piece that you could run off and print, and it was a larger print, and it printed in 4 hours and 35 minutes using the standard settings provided by the Hitry team. I also tried printing these super minimal supports because this machine, the way that it actually works, you should be able to print with a lot less supports than you typically see with your standard resin printers. So they have these little army figures or these little people that you can run off and print. It was a 33-minute print and it worked okay. Again, I think it had to do with some of it was the leveling of that build plate versus anything, but most of them printed, and I was honestly a little shocked to see them actually printing with only one support. So I then wanted to compare the print speeds that I'm getting off of the Rocket 1 to the other printer that I have in my arsenal of machines that is easily the fastest printer that I have on hand, which is the Elegoo Mars 3. This thing prints fantastic and is, up until now, I thought was the fastest machine that I could get my hands on at an affordable price range. The Rocket 1 is actually beating it in its print times. So the Rocket 1 printed this Scarlet Witch bust in 4 hours and 30 minutes. The Mars 3 printed the exact same Scarlet Witch bust in the same scale and supports and all that goodness at 4 hours and 50 minutes. Both prints look great, but obviously the Rocket 1 was able to print this a good bit faster than I was able to on the Mars 3. And I think some of that comes down to some of the settings there, but I wanted to test that even further by tweaking the settings even slightly further and using some of that Soriatech green resin that I had shown previously, where I printed this Boba Fett bust from Fotis on the Rocket 1 in 1 hour and 42 minutes. Comparing that to the Mars 3 with the same resin and the same settings that I was running before, those are my default settings that I always run on the Mars 3, the Boba Fett bust printed in 3 hours and 11 minutes, and the print actually failed twice. So not only did it print faster, but I had zero issues with it printing compared to the Mars 3 for this particular resin. Again, it's probably going to come down to settings that I needed to tweak for the specific resin that I didn't go ahead and do. I was just running my standard Mars 3 settings that works pretty dang well for Soriatech's resin as well as Elegoo's resin. And yeah, I was very, very, very impressed with how fast the Rocket 1 printed. Am I seeing the speeds that they claim it can print at? No, not necessarily on anything that I've sliced for myself. And again, I went back and retried to slice the Scarlet Witch and print that at their 0.1 millimeter and their crazy fast print speeds, and it did not work at all. It turned out really interesting, but a big failed print nonetheless. Now, this was a way longer video than I normally shoot and record and publish for you guys, but there was so much to cover here for the Rocket 1 and wanted to make sure I try and cram in as much as I possibly can. If there are additional things that you'd like to see me cover, let me know, because I'll definitely be looking at doing a follow-up video answering some of your questions. So let me know down in the comments below what other questions you have or what you'd like to see me print on this machine. Like I've said throughout the video, there are some quirks with using this machine, and it's certainly messier than any other Resin 3D printer that I've ever worked with. But again, I think it might come down to a bit of a learning curve more than anything on using this type of machine over your traditional Resin 3D printer that you're seeing on the market today. I'm very excited about this technology and the potential for those crazy fast print times along with some great looking prints. And I am getting some really nice looking prints off of this machine. I also want to take a minute to say a big thank you to all my Patreon members for all of your continued support. If you're interested in more information about my resin support settings, I'll also be looking at how I can properly create a resin profile or profiles for the Hitry Rocket 1, which will be included as part of my Patreon. But let me know down below what you think about the Hitry Rocket 1, and if you'd be interested in picking up one for yourself over on Kickstarter, or if there's something that I've missed that you want to see covered. Again, let me know down below, because I'd love to make a further follow-up, because I will definitely be printing more with this while I have it on hand before I have to send it back to the folks over at Hitry. Hey, thanks so much for watching, and if you've made it all the way here, congratulations. This was a super long video. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye now.